Is it the beginning of the end of the longest military campaign in U.S. history? 17 years after a coalition chased the Taliban out of Kabul, Washington's envoy reaching a tentative deal on a roadmap that would see U.S. forces pull out by an as-of-yet unspecified date. But there are many ifs. That's if the Taliban themselves unite behind the plan, if the insurgents negotiate a durable ceasefire with the government in Kabul, and if Ashraf Ghani is still the president of Afghanistan. Ghani, who was not part of the talks in Qatar, he's running for re-election in July. More broadly, can Afghanistan's government go it alone once the U.S. withdraws? For ordinary citizens, is it really a choice between, well, corruption and mismanagement and the return of an Islamic fundamentalist regime that strips women of their rights? For Donald Trump, it would certainly be quite the coup to succeed where predecessors have failed in bringing the boys home, unless, like we've seen in Iraq, it means having to make a quick return after the Syria pullout announcement. What exactly does the future hold for the U.S. military on the world stage? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about talking to the Taliban. And joining us from Washington, former Afghan ambassador to France, Omar Samad, who's non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
From Lahore in Pakistan, Ahmed Rashid, author of Taliban, Militant Islam, Oil, and Fundamentalism in Central Asia. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
From Beirut, Graham Smith, Afghanistan consultant at International Crisis Group. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And here in the studio, France24.com senior producer Leila Jacinto. How are you?
Good, good.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, news of the breakthrough broke on Monday after the talks had concluded and the Afghan-born U.S. envoy Zalmay Khalilzad had traveled on to Kabul to brief President Karzai. Shirley Sitbon has more.
U.S. troops in Afghanistan, their departure is the key demand from the Taliban, a principle U.S. negotiators agreed to in Doha, although according to the chief U.S. negotiator, no timetable has been set. In exchange, the militant group accepted a demand made by the U.S.
The Taliban have committed to our satisfaction to do what is necessary that would prevent Afghanistan from ever becoming a platform for international terrorist groups or individuals.
But the Taliban have not agreed to a ceasefire. They're not even willing to talk to the Afghan government. So when the U.S. envoy briefed Afghan leaders, he got a cautious response.
We want peace. We want it fast. But we want a plan for it. Having a plan is very important because we don't want to repeat past mistakes.
What the Afghans dread is that without a real peace deal, once foreign troops are gone, the Taliban would continue or even strengthen their attacks, something the country has faced before. That's why the Afghans want to approve and be part of any agreement the U.S. will seal with the Taliban.
Omar Samad, when the news broke Monday, were you celebrating?
No, not yet. It's too early to celebrate anything. It's time to focus on what's priority, what has been accomplished so far in terms of talks that you mentioned earlier, about having a framework that includes several moving pieces, things that are inconclusive. There's no, obviously, outcome or result for any of this. But I think the United States and the Taliban have made some headway. It remains to be seen how the other actors, being the government in Kabul and the political elites or the political class in Kabul, are going to be incorporated into this, and how the region also will react to how the U.S. and the Taliban have so far taken some steps.
Yeah, we'll talk about the regional reactions in a moment. But first, Ahmed Rashid, how big a breakthrough is it? Could the Trump administration succeed where, for instance, the late envoy Richard Holbrooke failed in forging some kind of a solution?
Well, I think there's a very big difference between past U.S. dialogue with the Taliban and the current one, and that is that the U.S. has declared its intentions to leave. And in fact, the U.S. military, the Pentagon, the State Department, there might be some objections there, but they're all working now towards a departure of U.S. troops. And that's precisely what the Taliban have demanded all along. The Taliban have said that once the Americans leave, we will stop fighting. So now, of course, there has to be an agreement to hold the Taliban to that promise. And I think what we're seeing, there's a two-phase dialogue here. The first phase is what we're seeing now, where the broad outlines of an agreement between the Taliban and the Americans will be reached, in which the main aspect will be actually the ceasefire. That's what the Afghans want more than anything else. And the second part of the dialogue will not be with the Americans, but will be with the Taliban and the Afghan government. And that, of course, as Umar said, has its own complications and could be even more difficult than this present dialogue. And the third part of it is what we've talked about, is the regional situation, where the regional countries would have to support whatever agreement was reached.
So lots of pieces in that puzzle. A lot's been made of the fact that there is Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, one of the main senior commanders inside of the Taliban, Ahmed, who was privy to these talks. Can the Taliban speak with one voice today?
Well, we don't know that. We have to see what happens once this agreement is signed, and we see if there are militant commanders and others who within the Taliban who might object to it. But certainly the appointment of Abdul Ghani Baradar, I think, is very significant. He's been in a Pakistani jail for 8.5 years. He suffered enormously, and he was at the center of peace attempts with the former President Karzai in 2010. And even after the Taliban were defeated in 2001, he was trying to make some accommodation with the Afghan government, which the Americans scotched. So he has a record. And at the same time, he's very much highly regarded, revered within the Taliban rank and file, within the foot soldiers. There are a lot of stories and legends about him. He was very close to Mullah Omar, and a very modest man. And generally, I think the point of his appointment is that it'll be very difficult for Taliban commanders to go up against him, because so whatever decisions he makes, we can presume that those decisions will hold and will be accepted by the Taliban generally.
Graham Smith, I'm seeing that two of those who took part in the negotiations had been in Guantanamo as prisoners and traded when, in exchange for U.S. Sergeant Bo Bergdahl back in 2014. So, yeah, these are prominent people within the Taliban. What's the recipe, though, now? Going forward for that phase 2 that Ahmed Rashid was talking about, which is direct talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban?
Well, now comes the hard part, right? I mean, Zal Khalilzad has sort of plucked the low-hanging fruit. The Taliban all along have been saying that they're not very enthusiastic about international jihadists hiding inside Afghanistan, and so persuading them to provide no safe haven for terrorists is really an easy ask. Now that we know that the Americans want to leave, that's another major piece of the puzzle, as Ahmed Rashid has said. And the final two pieces of the puzzle, getting to some sort of a ceasefire and starting some sort of a conversation inside Afghanistan among all the various factions about the political future of the country, those are the really hard parts coming up. And we don't even know yet the structure of those talks. You say that it would be a conversation between the Taliban and the Afghan government. So, I mean, it should at least be that, because there are lots of other political factions in Afghanistan that will want a piece of the action. I think the conversations are ongoing right now between the U.S. and the Taliban. I understand that they're going to resume negotiations in the coming weeks, and you can expect very hard conversations coming up about the structure of these future talks. But, you know, really, it's worth pausing to reflect on how far we have come. I mean, this time last year, you know, we were nowhere near any sort of a political process. The war in Afghanistan is now the biggest conflict in the world. It's bigger than the war in Yemen. It's bigger than the war in Syria. By some measures, it's bigger than the two of them combined, with 44,000 battle deaths per year. So it's really long overdue that this escalating war finds some sort of political settlement, and it looks like that's on the horizon for the very first time.
Is there the sense that it's a stalemate? What, the Taliban control roughly a third of the territory in Afghanistan, but none of the major cities? They have gained some ground over the past few years. Is it just a long stalemate at this point?
So probably the most optimistic estimates of how much territory the government controls are drawn up by the U.S. military and published by the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR. Those estimates show that the government holds less and less territory as time goes on. And they've just published a new estimate in the last week, again showing diminished territory held by the government and more territory held by the Taliban. So I think by any classical definition, whenever one side is gaining ground and the other side is losing ground, that's not really a stalemate. But you do make a good point more broadly that I think the Taliban realize that they don't really want to rerun the civil wars of the 1990s. Because think about it, their enemies are now heavily armed billionaires, right? So it's not going to be a cakewalk for the Taliban if they want to fight this out. And so I think there's a lot of interest on all sides in finding a political solution instead of a military solution.
Leila Jacinto, the time is right?
Well, I mean, this peace process has been going on for a while, and I absolutely agree with Omar when he said, you know, and with Ahmad, of course, what's different now is the U.S. conviction to pull out. But these, you know, what seems to be agreed to in this very premature framework is really nothing much. You know, the Taliban guaranteeing Afghanistan would not be used by terrorists. Nowhere did I see the mention of the word Al-Qaeda. But, you know, the Taliban has been distancing itself from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, meanwhile, is, you know, in their statements, they're still committed to the Taliban, the Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan. So how can these guarantees even be delivered? And, you know, no ceasefire. That is an extremely basic agreement. And, you know, very important, which I'm sure we'll be coming to, are the regional players and other players. Russia, Moscow is going to hold talks now as well, next week, in fact. Once again, no Afghan government representative because the Taliban doesn't want it. So the Taliban is gaining territory. They seem to be winning. The stats are showing they seem to be winning, and they are setting the terms. They are still setting the terms. So I feel like it's an important moment, but there's also a lot of hype.
Yeah.
And Zalmay Khalilzad, to be fair, has been saying this is extremely premature.
Right. You were mentioning outside players across the border. When he spoke at a youth conference in Kabul on Wednesday, Afghanistan's president was keen to put the accent on the fact that the key to peace for him is perhaps inside Afghanistan, but he looked to neighboring Pakistan as a source of trouble.
The key to achieving peace in Kabul is a practical and inclusive plan. But the keys to war are in Islamabad, Rawalpindi, and Quetta.
Ahmed Rashid, the keys to war are in Pakistan?
Well, certainly, I mean, he has a point there in that the Taliban leadership has been based in Pakistan for very many years, um, but you know, Pakistan, although it may to some extent have some influence over the Taliban, it's been a love-hate relationship. There are Taliban who've tried to break out of this and approach Iran, approach Russia. Deal with other countries, and some of them have been jailed by Pakistan. As Abdul Ghani brother was jailed for trying to launch a peace initiative without the permission of Pakistan. But I think the situation now is very different. I think what we've seen in the last few weeks is a big change in the Pakistan military attitude to these peace talks. I think they are supporting these peace talks. And for the first time, we've seen requests by the Americans being fulfilled. It was Mr. Khalilzad who asked for the release of Ghani brother and who asked for the release of other Taliban leaders who were in prison. Pakistan has flown some Taliban to Doha in Qatar where they could have talks. So there's been a lot more cooperation. And I think what we're seeing is that the whole region is so fed up with this fighting and the war and the spillover, which is drugs and militancy, extremism, etc., that everybody wants a peace. And even I think we could well be seeing a change in Pakistan's direction. The big question for me and for many Pakistanis is that is this shift a change? Is it a tactical change or is it a strategic shift that is happening? And we all, of course, hope that this will be a long-term shift by the Pakistani authorities.
Omar Samad, do you agree there is a change on the part of Pakistan?
I'm not sure yet. Again, I don't know if it's tactical, as Ahmed said, or strategic. What we do know is there's no reason for Pakistan to be worried at this point because the Taliban seem to have momentum. They are being sort of recognized by all sides as an important party, a key party to these talks and to the future of the country. And they may, have whatever ties the Pakistani establishment has with the Taliban is safe. And so Pakistani interests have been forwarded and are protected at this point. What really matters is, at this point, how are we going to handle, on one hand, the issue of the American withdrawal, the timetable, how long it will take, how many troops are going to be withdrawn, and at the end of it, are we going to have a residual force that will make sure that nothing unravels or that there's a counterterrorism component to this, where a multinational engagement may be needed, including the Americans, and on the other hand, the Taliban giving assurances that they have severe ties with Al-Qaeda and Daesh. How are we going to implement that, enforce that, and guarantee that there will be no more behind-the-scenes relationships with terrorist groups? So these are issues right now that have not been fully hashed out.
Not fully hashed out. Omar Samad, I'm gonna have to interrupt you because we have to take a very quick break. We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. I want to thank Ahmed Rashid, who unfortunately can't join us for part 2, but we will continue that important part of the discussion when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Talking to the Taliban, that's the topic here in the France 24 debate. Welcome back. We're discussing that breakthrough that took place between the U.S. envoy and the insurgency at meetings that concluded last week in Qatar. With us to talk about it, former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada, Omar Samad, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Joining us from Beirut, Graham Smith, Afghanistan consultant for International Crisis Group, and France 24's very own Leila Jacinto. Yeah, we were just talking before the break about Pakistan perhaps pivoting in the way it looks at the matters of these talks across the border in Pakistan, authorities welcoming the possibility of a U.S. exit from Afghanistan?
They've been here for so many years. So whatever the destruction has taken place in Afghanistan, Afghanistan needs to be rebuilt. So U.S. should go out of Afghanistan through the forces, but should stay there for the development purpose.
Yeah, and it raises that question, Graham Smith, of who's supporting who at this point in time. What's the relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban?
Well, as you said earlier, a lot of the Taliban leaders live in Pakistan, and they have certainly benefited from having a safe haven on the other side of the border. I think it's a little early to talk about a full pivot. That is to say, I don't think there's been an entirely a U-turn by the Pakistanis in terms of their relationship with the Taliban. But I think Ahmed Rashid was correct to say that the Pakistanis are being somewhat more constructive this time around. Certainly releasing Mullah Bradar was a big step forward. And sort of just getting out of the way of talks is also really, really an important step by the Pakistanis. I think that actually, the biggest moving part here, to be honest with you, is the Americans. When the Americans say they intend to leave Afghanistan, they don't intend to have a sort of forever war footprint of military bases in South Asia, that forces governments like Pakistan's and Iran's and the Central Asian states and others to sort of rethink their Afghanistan policy because, frankly speaking, for a long time, for a lot of the region, it had been all about harassing the Americans, supplying the Taliban with just enough weapons to make the Americans uncomfortable, but not enough to, start some sort of major regional war. And so now that the Americans look like they're leaving, it's no longer enough just to offer a little bit of covert support to the Taliban. You have to think about stability on your own doorstep. Do you really want a fire in your own region as Afghanistan descends into a civil war? And I think the answer is no. And so all of these regional countries are actually becoming a little more helpful when it comes to trying to make peace in Afghanistan.
You agree, Omar Samad, there won't be some kind of scramble for Afghanistan with various regional players embarking on a new civil war?
Well, I agree. Civil war is probably not to anyone's interest. Chaos in Afghanistan is going to burn everybody else's hand and create mayhem across all of the borders, all the countries that border Afghanistan. But each country has a different perspective, obviously, and their interests are defined not totally aligned with one another. The Russians obviously have issues with the Americans on the global scale. And so Afghanistan is one item for them. And for the Iranians, obviously, they have very severe, deep issues with the West and with America, especially the Trump administration. So they look at it from their perspective. Then you have the Indians and you have the Arabs, the Saudis and the UAE and Qatar, who now are playing a much bigger role. And they have been also sort of encouraging Pakistan to play a more constructive role for their own reasons. And Pakistan has received a lot of money from the Arabs and the Chinese lately. And then the Chinese themselves obviously have a worldview based on economic expansion, opening trade routes, and so on and so forth. And at the end, you have Pakistan. Pakistan has played this very pivotal role because of its closeness to the Taliban, because it has pursued a very specific policy for the past 25, 30 years in regards to Afghanistan. And it remains to be seen. Afghans are very wary of how Pakistan is going to pivot or not, and whether it's going to be a constructive actor or continue to be a destructive one.
And then there's the question of the Afghans themselves. Many have only known a state of war, and they're really of two minds when it comes to the future.
Everyone is tired of war and conflicts in this country, and we support any peace agreements between Afghans, Americans, and the Taliban for the prosperity of our country.
If the Taliban choose a better and softer policy for the youth, we'll be happy. But if it's a repeat of the 2001 era, then we won't be happy with it at all.
Leo Jacinto, at this point in time, all this is happening. Is that presidential election that's due to take place in July in a parallel universe, or is this gonna weigh on it? What's gonna? Are we really having a presidential election in Afghanistan in July?
Well, there will be a presidential election, and there will be like elections in Afghanistan. I mean, they had a parliamentary election, and there's a new parliament still not in. But I mean, what gives me some hope is just to see the players involved. For instance, Ghani, he's running on a ticket for vice president with Amrullah Saleh. He was a former interior minister, a former spy chief, who has disagreed with Ghani on negotiating with the Taliban, and he's seen as sort of very anti-Pakistan, anti-Taliban. So the fact that Ghani has managed to get someone of Saleh's standing, he's very controversial. But for the people who are really nervous about these peace talks, it shows that there could be some willingness to bring it all together. But what's important is that, with all these gains that are being made, are we going to just, let whatever the 17 years, we talk about the 17 years of war and conflict, but there's also been 17 years of gains in Afghanistan. And this is a democratically elected government, and of course...
Albeit with accusations of ballot stuffing that took place.
For sure. I mean, this is not an easy country to hold the democratic process, but there have been democratic gains, and they have made political gains as well. So, my question, and a lot of Afghans, you constantly hear Afghans saying, we don't want war. And I tell them, tell me the story. Who wants war? But the fact is, what's going to happen to all these gains? What are we going to do with the interim government, and how much support are we going to provide? There was the New York Times did this story today about Ashraf Ghani writing a letter to President Trump, offering to allow the U.S. to reduce its costs. Now, this is really understanding how President Trump works. There were no figures, apparently. It was just a broad call to negotiate how we can reduce the figures. But then we come to reduced U.S. commitments in Afghanistan. And it really doesn't look like there will be that much stability without, significant international support.
Is Ghani weakened or strengthened by the fact that he wasn't privy to this first round of talks? Obviously, there's going to be a lot of time between now and July, but is he weakened or strengthened through all this?
Look, every time I talk to people who are in the Afghan administration or Afghan officials, they always say that, the government is in with the U.S. on this because, the fact that he is not on the table does not look strong for him. However, having said that, when Zalmay Khalilzad this week came to Kabul to debrief President Ghani, the reception was remarkably cold. And I cannot imagine, I'm sure Ghani wants peace and wants a peace deal, but he does not come out looking that strong anymore.
Omar Samad, you agree?
I agree, but I also think that elections are up in the air. I don't think that the country can handle the two processes at the same time, meaning a peace process where the Taliban are against elections as we have known it, and do not want to talk to the government per se, but they do agree that the government should be part of a wider Afghan sort of gathering, but do not have the title or the label of government on it. So there are a lot of issues that have to be resolved in Kabul. There's talk about maybe for going to a transitional period. Now, whether the transitional period is going to lead to another government, an interim government that everybody agrees to, and signs up for is a question that is being discussed right now, and it's a very thorny one. But I think that overall, all politicians have been weakened in Afghanistan, except for those who have been able to offer solutions. So you have a lot of different actors, candidates. You have people like Ghani, like Abdullah. You have former Minister Atmar, who has tried to offer solutions both on the peace side as well as saying that elections are important at some point. But then what takes priority right now for Afghans? And there's a process, and there's America that's pushing for a withdrawal. At the same time, the region wants an outcome. So it's a very complex situation with a lot of moving parts, as we said earlier. And we are still at the beginning of a complex process, in my opinion.
All right, and another piece of that context, and you mentioned it earlier, is Russia. On the heels of the U.S. Taliban breakthrough in Doha, a photo op for another pair of former foes. The Russian presidential envoy to Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov, on Tuesday, met with the Pakistani foreign minister, Shah Mahmood Qureshi, in Islamabad. Russia, which used to occupy Afghanistan, remember. And this Thursday, Russia announced it would be hosting a one-day conference where senior Taliban leaders and prominent Afghan politicians will be traveling to Moscow for a day-long summit. At this sensitive stage, it was, quote, best not to have Afghan government officials at the table. Graham Smith, is this just a propaganda exercise, this meeting? Or do the Russians really have an active stake in this? Are they part of the problem, part of the solution? What's this all about?
Well, we'll see whether or not it's part of the problem or part of the solution, but certainly the Russians are getting their chips on the table, making sure that they have some kind of a hand in whatever kind of political settlement emerges. The Kabul government is not thrilled about this Moscow track. They tried to shut it down in September and they failed. It sort of barreled ahead anyways because the Russians had a relationship with the Taliban and in fact provided the Taliban Political Commission with its sort of diplomatic coming out party late last year as delegations from around the world came to listen to a bunch of Taliban sitting in front of microphones with little nameplates that said Taliban movement rather than the Islamic Emirate. But, the Russians do have legitimate interests in the region. And it's worth remembering, that the region can't withdraw. The Americans can leave Afghanistan, but all of its neighbors are stuck with whatever happens next. Russia provides security assistance right down to the Amudarya River, to the Central Asian nations. So, it does worry about what emerges from this process.
You heard Graham Omar Samad say how the whole region is, a little bit thrown off by the United States, that it's packing up and going. I mean, we saw it with the pullout announced by Donald Trump for northeast Syria. Is the United States' days of flexing its military might around the globe, are those days numbered?
Well, the United States is still the world's preeminent military superpower, and that's not going to change. But what I think has changed is the United States' understanding of what is scary. If you look at the threat assessments produced as a consensus document by the U.S. intelligence community, they've really shifted away from emphasizing terrorism as a leading threat to the homeland. And even the way that the United States thinks about combating terrorism is starting to change. And I think part of what you're seeing here in terms of a shifting strategy in Afghanistan is a bit of an understanding by the United States that maybe you don't need this vast archipelago of military bases that spans the globe, or at least maybe not in places like Afghanistan, where wherever you put a base in, a great conflagration of violence erupts. So, I think the shifting U.S. footprint globally can be constructive in terms of trying to reduce levels of violence in Afghanistan.
But hang on, there's a danger in what you're saying here, because you have Donald Trump, who comes in as president and who announces this whopping big budget increase for the Pentagon. How did the generals then justify their pay?
Is that a problem, figuring out how generals justify their pay? I don't know.
How they justify the budgets
downrange.
What's their mission now? If, as you say, we're in this period where we're being more tactical, paying more attention to risk, what's the mission of the Pentagon in the?
Well, the strategic documents that come out of Washington suggest that the Pentagon is worried more and more these days about what they call peer or near peer great power competition. So the prospect that the United States might someday have to fight a war with China or Russia or some other major power, as opposed to what had been sort of the fashion in the Pentagon about 10 years ago, counterinsurgency doctrine, this idea that we were going to fight a bunch of small wars in remote, dusty places, often with partner governments against rebels and insurgents.
Leila Jacinto, 2001, it was after the 9/11 attacks that U.S.-led coalition goes into Afghanistan. Did you think 17 years later they'd still be U.S. troops there?
No, but I mean, there were mistakes on the U.S. part, notably the 2003 Iraq War. But I mean, you know, for instance, when you're talking about the U.S. military, I mean, we just had Dan Coates, who's the director of national intelligence, you know, in his assessment to Congress, said that militant groups supported by Pakistan will continue to be a threat in 2019. The Republican U.S. Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, is now introducing an amendment calling Al-Qaeda and Islamic State groups still a serious threat in Syria and Afghanistan. And, you know, when you're talking about the Americans, you're not talking about a uniform voice. I mean, look at who's in the Trump administration. General McMaster is gone. Jim Mattis is gone. You know, so these were the generals who were pushing for engagement. Now, what happens with, you know, this whole engagement, disengagement cost, what can the U.S. do debate, is what happens is that the people who talk about disengaging U.S. troops from Syria, so when, you know, Trump can, with a tweet, you know, blow all these cards aside, and we know, you know, what kind of partner we are dealing with. But when Trump announces, you know, a shock withdrawal of U.S. troops, then you see, you know, the people who are going, oh, we don't need U.S. troops, going like, wait a second, you know, this is way too fast. You know, what is Turkey going to do? You know, that's when you see what are the, so in a way, you know, even the U.S. presence there has managed to get some coherence within the Taliban. Like, what do they agree on? Okay, they all agree on that they do not want the U.S. troops there. What happens when the U.S. troops pull out? What is the level of coherence within the Taliban? How can they guarantee that this will not be a safe haven for terrorists? And as you say, we come back full circle because this all was sparked by 9/11. Afghanistan remains a sort of the cradle of the jihadist movement. I travel into Africa, etc. They still see Afghanistan as this is where it all began. And that's what's brought us there in the first place. And this is starting to look like a very hasty withdrawal, unless it goes really slowly.
Unless it goes really slowly. When it will be, we don't know. I want to thank you, Leila Jacinto. I want to thank Omar Samad for being with us from Washington and Graham Smith in Beirut. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Sanam Chantier.
Hello, Francois.
And, of course, Afghanistan does have a thriving press.
Indeed it does. I want to start off with Hashta Sob, which in English means 8 a.m. in the morning. And this is about to come up, hopefully. It's the leading independent daily newspaper in Afghanistan. And one of the main stories this Thursday, that was half of the screen there, is focusing on the fact that you've got Afghan officials, various of them, saying that the Trump administration, despite having signaled previously very long-term commitment, is now caring little for what the impact of this American withdrawal will be. And we have, of course, that image from 2017 of the President Ashraf Ghani with his U.S. counterpart, Donald Trump. I also decided to take a look at Tolo News, that you may be familiar with this. It was, of course, Afghanistan's first 24-hour news channel. They also have a website in English.
Which is very good.
Which is actually very good, very, very informative. And they're running with this piece. It's been getting quite a bit of traction about Afghan clerics calling on the Taliban to lay down their arms and start face-to-face negotiations with the government. Now, of course, we know that at the helm of Tolo News, we have none other than Saad Mohseni, who is the Afghan-Australian media mogul in the country. He himself has been very vocal about the diplomatic process. He's someone who's been very active in cleaning up Afghanistan's electoral process even, and he took to Twitter earlier this Thursday to say, we may not like it, but it is a reality that us Afghans have to come to terms with. Standing united is a start. Why isn't the government involving or reaching out to key Afghan stakeholders and including them in the peace process not enough to have some token advisory group?
Is that a fair criticism, Leela?
Yes, it is. I mean, Afghanistan has a national unity government, which is sometimes called the national disunity government. I mean, Ghani did make an outreach this week with his vice presidential ticket, but Saad Mohseni tends to be right, and he's a friend.
I agree.
Objective.
I agree on both counts. And of course, we know that this is something that was coming up during the Yemen negotiations as well, saying that we need to have all parties at the table for it to be a success.
All right. We're asked the question, who stands to gain, who stands to lose from this, from what's only the beginning of this process?
Also, something that's being overlooked, and there's an important piece on this by Human Rights Watch from earlier, which takes a look at how there's a fear that a peace agreement may not necessarily mean peace for women in Afghanistan. It delves into how women have, of course, as we know, suffered at the hands of the Taliban. We know there was a time when they couldn't study, they couldn't hold a job, they couldn't leave the house without wearing a burqa.
The Taliban promised it won't be the case anymore.
It won't be the case, but it still continued to be the case whilst they've managed to scale back some of their restrictions. That women are still very much repressed. And of course, as a result of this, since the announcement of a US...
No, this is really important, and everybody seems to be just taking the Taliban's concessionary words for now. But this was women in Afghanistan are absolutely scared of what could happen.
Immensely. And what's interesting is, of course, and this doesn't come as a surprise, various Afghan officials have been questioned over this, whether some of the advances that the minority groups, including women, made would be scaled back. And here's an interview by NPR with the Afghan ambassador to the United States, Roya Rahmani, who's also a woman, who said that she doesn't believe the country could fall back because she says, and this is a rather optimistic viewpoint, this is a changed nations, she says. For me, that's a rather big statement because, of course, women's rights in Afghanistan, like any other country in the region or in the world, doesn't just rest with the leadership of that country. I have an interesting one here. We had a survey from this group, which was actually taken off the website very recently by Promundo, which is a gender equality group, that says, in Afghanistan, ordinary men, 2 out of 3 men think women have too many rights. And I think what will actually surprise you both here is that women themselves are not fully on board with the idea of parity. The same thing that I saw when I was in Saudi Arabia. They're not quite prepared for it yet. Now, despite all this pessimism that we've been talking about, there's one story about the lack of women's roles in the world of politics. There's a story that's been getting a lot of traction today on social media. It's a piece on a woman called Mariam Wardak. She's a woman with her feet in 2 worlds. She's someone who spent a large chunk of her life in Afghanistan. She grew up in the United States and she was very much involved in the country's political scene. And so as a result of that, some observers and journalists, as Sunni Engel Rasmussen, who previously covered Afghanistan very closely, it brings him to say, inshallah, which means God willing, one day women will run the country. So leaving you with a slightly overly optimistic note there.
Well, I hope I live to see that day. But that's true. But there are
sense a huge amount of optimism when you
to lead Afghanistan. As you said, women themselves need to be aware that they need to be empowered. That's one thing. Having said that, there are Afghan parliamentarians and there are Afghan women's rights workers.
Absolutely. And her mother ran for the position as well. So
totally.
Yeah.
But reaching out to in a nation of we don't even know how many, 33 million, that's where you see that these gains are really, really long term. You've got to keep at it.
All right, Leela Jacinto, I want to thank you. I want to thank Sanam Shanti. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.